Imagine waking up to discover that a massive piece of the map has simply vanished. Yesterday it was there, with its more than 3.5 million square miles, hundreds of millions of inhabitants, dozens of gigantic cities, and undeniable economic and cultural influence. But today, everything has disappeared. That's right. In this new scenario, the United States of America has ceased to exist. No people, no buildings, no companies, not even physical territory, as if this nation had been removed with the snap of a finger, leaving behind only ocean. It might sound like science fiction, but let's explore this hypothesis. After all, understanding the consequences of a world without the USA helps us reflect on the depth of its connections with the rest of the planet. We'll discuss what would change in geopolitics, economics, culture, science, and of course, how other nations would react. Ready? Let's dive in. As soon as the dust from this magical removal settles, the shock would be enormous. Much of the Western Hemisphere would be stunned. Even rival countries would likely feel a mix of relief and concern, those who benefited from commercial and military partnerships with Americans would see their economies and defensive strategies destabilize almost instantly. The country would become a massive island, as its border with the US would cease to exist. More than 5,000 miles of border would be replaced by a new coastline, which, at first, might even favor maritime trade routes. However, losing its largest trading partner, the US normally absorbs around 75% of all Canadian exports, would cause a brutal drop in economic activity. In the long term, the country could redirect its trade toward Europe or Asia, taking advantage of a potential expansion of ports in what was once solid ground. Similar situation, the northern border disappears. But unlike Canada, Mexico wouldn't become an island, since it still borders Belize and Guatemala to the south. However, the US accounts for about 80% of Mexican exports. It's an enormous dependency, both in goods and capital, that would suddenly cease to exist. The drop in remittances from Mexican immigrants living in the US. Before the disappearance, this money transfer reached tens of billions of dollars annually, would be another blow to the local economy. Countries like the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and the Bahamas receive millions of American tourists annually. With the US gone, most of this flow would evaporate. Additionally, many citizens of Central American countries, such as El Salvador and Honduras, who had relatives in the United States, would lose the remittances that sustained their local economies. The United States doesn't just occupy a dominant position on its continent. It also forms the world's largest military power, is a fundamental part of alliances like NATO, and leads numerous political and commercial pacts. Suddenly, all that influence and protection disappears. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created largely to counterbalance the influence of rival powers. Without the US, NATO's deterrence power would be compromised, as almost 70% of the bloc's military spending came from Americans. European countries would need, more than ever, to strengthen their defense budgets and seek partnerships among themselves. Germany and France, the continent's economic powers, would likely assume a central role, but the military gap would be enormous. With the disappearance of the US, China would emerge even more as the main candidate for global superpower. It's already the world's second-largest economy, or the first depending on how GDP is measured, has the largest population on the planet, more than 1.4 billion people, and invests heavily in technology, infrastructure, and armed forces. Without the American counterweight, Beijing would have more freedom to project power in the Asia-Pacific region, and perhaps put even more pressure on disputed territories. Although it has a smaller GDP than medium-sized European countries, Russia maintains relevant military forces and a strong arms industry. Without the US, Moscow might feel less inhibited regarding regional conflicts and even recover territories lost in the past, including those it claims as part of its historical space. With a rapidly growing economy, a large population, more than 1.4 billion, rivaling China, and an advanced space program, India could seek to occupy part of the political and economic space left by the US. For many analysts, the EU is the second-largest global economy if we consider the bloc as a unit. However, without American support, the EU would need to reorganize its foreign and security policy at the risk of becoming hostage to more aggressive powers. The American currency, the dollar, is the main pillar of international trade and one of the world's most important stores of value. Countries around the globe hold trillions of dollars in foreign exchange reserves to stabilize their currencies, honor international debts, and secure commercial transactions. Without the US economy behind it, the dollar would lose all institutional support, ceasing to exist practically overnight. Various nations that use this currency in large volumes would have to seek immediate alternatives, such as the euro, Japanese yen, or Chinese yuan. The absence of the dollar would generate unprecedented financial uncertainty. Central banks and large conglomerates would have to renegotiate debts in other currencies, and market volatility could be extremely high. The New York Stock Exchange and Nasdaq, two of the world's largest, would disappear at the same split second the country vanishes. Global investors who owned shares of American companies would, in practice, lose all invested capital. This disappearance would nullify trillions of dollars in asset valuations, causing chain bankruptcies in banks and funds spread across various countries. It would certainly be the largest financial crash ever recorded in human history. It's hard to overestimate how much the United States influences world technology, from big tech to Silicon Valley, through renowned universities like Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. Much of recent innovations in computing, medicine, and energy come from there. Google, Amazon, and various other companies are headquartered in the US, providing infrastructure and services to billions of people. The sudden removal of all server infrastructure, offices, and development teams would mean the end of many applications and platforms used worldwide. Much of the so-called internet backbone, submarine cables, large data centers, and even some DNS root servers is located in American territory. This sudden disappearance could fragment the internet and even create regional connection islands. The US also houses cutting-edge laboratories, medical institutes, and headquarters of major pharmaceutical companies. Many research studies on vaccines, cancer treatments, and new gene therapies would lose funding or access to crucial resources. Several epidemic control programs rely on support from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. Without this technical cooperation and funding, surveillance of communicable diseases would be impaired in various parts of the globe. Finally, it's impossible not to mention the cultural side of this upheaval. A world without Hollywood, without American series, without the massive musical influence of the US. The changes would be profound. In 2019 alone, the US film market generated more than $40 billion in box office receipts. Considering domestic and international revenue, the entire structure of studios, festivals, and awards would disappear, making room for emerging film centers in other countries, such as China, with a gigantic domestic market, India, Bollywood, and South Korea, growing in popularity. Beyond cinema, Disney, for example, which controls theme parks, cruise lines, and TV channels, would disappear along with all its characters and productions. It would be a worldwide cultural shock, although on the other hand, this could boost European, Asian, and Latin studios to create their own entertainment universes. The disappearance of American record labels and artists would open space for other styles and languages to go mainstream. K-pop, for example, could become even more global, and African and Latin music genres could reach new levels of worldwide popularity. New York is considered one of the global fashion capitals. Without major American clothing and accessory, names, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom could dominate international runways. Designers from emerging countries would also have more chances to emerge and consolidate in the global market. When the country that invests the most in research and development of clean technologies disappears, the world loses much more than carbon emissions. It also loses scientific advances and solutions that could help curb climate change. Before disappearing, the US was responsible for about 15% of global carbon dioxide emissions, according to recent data from the International Energy Agency. It's true that this portion had been decreasing as solar and wind energy initiatives and even carbon capture were gaining strength. Between 2020 and 2022, it's estimated that the United States injected more than $100 billion into green technologies, including electric cars and renewable energy. Without this capital injection, many innovative projects worldwide, not just in American territory, would lose sponsorship, resulting in a likely setback in the fight for environmental preservation. The US was present in virtually all environmental forums of global relevance, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Without this country to mediate, finance, and often pressure for certain measures, more polluting nations could relax their commitments or delay greenhouse gas reduction targets. Foundations headquartered in American territory, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, although primarily focused on health, also support sustainability projects in developing nations. With the US gone, these entities would cease to exist or lose their operations, affecting thousands of local reforestation, water resource management, and environmental education programs. The US has always been one of the largest donors of humanitarian aid, both in money and in the dispatch of supplies, technical personnel, and logistical support. In 2022, for example, the country allocated tens of billions of dollars to programs combating poverty and natural disasters in various parts of the world. Large portions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America received direct or indirect support from the United States for nutrition, basic sanitation, and vaccination programs. Without these resources, many regions could face outbreaks of already controlled diseases and drastic increases in infant mortality rates. In some nations, the American presence, even if sometimes criticized, ensured a certain level of political stability. Without any external support, internal conflicts could escalate rapidly, generating waves of refugees and even more serious humanitarian crises. Various global NGOs, such as the American Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders with headquarters in American territory in partnership with the Global NGO, and UN-linked institutes that had offices in Washington or New York would lose much of their infrastructure and funding. In the absence of US support, regional blocs and other powers could try to fill the gap, but this process is long and uncertain. Countries such as Germany, France, Japan, and even emerging powers like Turkey and India could unite in cooperation agreements, but they would hardly maintain the same level of investment. Another area rarely discussed in such a hypothetical scenario is the question of intelligence services. The CIA, NSA, and FBI, along with other agencies, represented a gigantic system for collecting and analyzing strategic information around the planet. With the disappearance of the United States, many secret operations ceased to exist, opening space for rival countries to expand intelligence networks without the American shadow. For some governments, it would be a relief to no longer be monitored by US services. For others, however, it would mean less protection against terrorist groups, cyber criminals, and global trafficking networks. Without the cooperation of North American digital security agencies, part of the internet infrastructure in allied countries would become more vulnerable to hacker attacks. The US, with its large contingent of cybersecurity specialists, has intervened in various ransomware attacks and digital espionage. Powers that already have robust cyber espionage programs, such as Russia and China, may accelerate the pace of attacks, tests, and system manipulations in countries that previously relied on American support to defend themselves. NASA has always been synonymous with innovation and scientific advances, having put the first man on the moon in 1969. It's also one of the main partners at international projects, such as the International Space Station, ISS. Without the United States, the landscape of space exploration would change radically. The ISS depends not only on funding, but also on technology, spare parts, and know-how from NASA and American companies like SpaceX and Boeing. With the removal of the US, the project would be crippled, potentially even being deactivated. The European Space Agency, ESA, Roscosmos, Russia, CNSA, China, and ISRO, India, would continue to exist. Some of them could try to save the ISS or create new orbital laboratories, but it would take time and a huge financial investment. Additionally, international cooperation on major Mars exploration missions or asteroids would be much more difficult. Without the market and expertise of the United States, the satellite launch industry and commercial space flights, which have been growing a lot in recent years, would suffer a setback. Private companies from other countries could advance, but not with the same scale and intensity. On the other hand, this gap would open windows for China, increasingly ambitious in the space area, to become a leader in sending manned missions to the moon and eventually to Mars. India, which has already achieved feats such as reaching Mars at low cost, could also grow in importance. If there's something the United States exports in large quantities, besides entertainment and technology products, it's knowledge. Its universities rank at the top of global rankings, attracting students from all over the planet. By disappearing, thousands of researchers, laboratories, and innovation centers cease to exist. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, MIT, Stanford. The list of top-tier institutions is extensive. They not only produce revolutionary research, but also train leaders in virtually all areas of knowledge. Foreign students who were at these centers would simply be left without an institution. Scholarships and scientific partnerships would disappear, hindering the progression of projects relevant to health, engineering, robotics, and much more. Countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, which, despite being geographically close, would be isolated. Japan and Australia would see an increase in demand for their courses. However, without competition from the US, there might also be a lack of the main engine of advances in certain frontier research. Many of the greatest international talents were in the US or in direct cooperation with American universities. It's likely that this contingent would redistribute around the planet, but the transition wouldn't be easy, as it would require infrastructure and incentive programs in the receiving nations. A little discussed aspect, but of enormous relevance, the American philanthropic sector is one of the most active in the world. In 2021 alone, individuals and foundations in the United States collectively donated more than $480 billion to humanitarian, educational, medical, and cultural causes. Numerous American billionaires created foundations to support scientific research, poverty alleviation projects, scholarships, museums, and orchestras around the world. Without this investment, many arts and culture institutions and initiatives would lose much of their resources. For some non-governmental organizations, especially in education and health, these donations represented the largest portion of their annual budget. The loss of these contributions would mean, in many cases, ending activities or drastically reducing the scope of actions. The United States occupied a prominent position in food production, being responsible for exporting large quantities of grains, meats, and other agricultural products. With its sudden removal, hunger and imbalance in the international food market could become even more urgent issues. Soybeans, corn, and wheat. Together, these grains form the food base for much of the world's population, directly or indirectly, via animal feed. Before disappearing, the US was in many periods the largest exporter of soybeans and corn, and was always among the main suppliers of wheat. Without this gigantic volume, countries that depended on American imports, such as China, Japan, and some Middle Eastern countries, would need to turn to other suppliers, such as Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, Russia, and Canada. When one of the largest sources of grain disappears, the law of supply and demand triggers an increase in global prices. This can lead nations with less purchasing power to face serious supply difficulties, especially those already suffering from internal economic or political crises. The US is also a major supplier of beef and chicken, supplying, for example, the Chinese domestic market and various Asian countries. Without this channel, countries like Australia and Brazil could increase their participation, but the substitution would not be immediate, leading to price surges and even momentary shortages. Although Australia, Brazil, India, and Argentina are potential substitutes in this supply, the entire logistics chain would have to be rethought. Storage, ship routes, cargo insurance. Everything would change, generating extra costs and adaptation time. Agricultural machinery and input manufacturers, fertilizers, pesticides, advanced irrigation equipment, headquartered in the US, together with agrotechs and Silicon Valley startups focused on farm automation, would disappear. This would have a cascading effect, reducing global innovation in the sector. Countries like Israel, the Netherlands, and Japan, recognized for technological agriculture, could try to fill part of this gap. Still, the absence of financial support and the gigantic American consumer market would greatly delay the development of new solutions. The United States is not only an exporter of food, but also one of the largest producers of oil, natural gas, and strategic minerals. With its disappearance, there would be an upheaval in energy and raw materials markets. In recent years, shale exploration has made the United States one of the world's leading producers of oil and gas. With the immediate disappearance of this supply, OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and Russia would have greater power to determine prices. Possibly, the barrel of oil would jump to extremely high values, impacting transportation costs, industry, and energy generation worldwide. The surge in fossil fuel prices could accelerate the adoption of renewable energy in some regions, but at the same time, the drop in American investment in clean energy research would delay promising technologies, such as longer-lasting batteries and high-efficiency solar capture systems. Although China leads the production of many rare earth elements, the US still had reserves and participated in research for extracting strategic minerals on its own soil and in joint projects with other countries. Without this support, China could further increase its advantage in supplying these crucial inputs for the high-tech industry, chips, batteries, and electronic components. In the absence of the US, countries in Africa and Latin America, where there are important reserves of lithium, niobium, copper, and other metals, could assume greater prominence, but only if they could quickly attract investments and build infrastructure for exploration and refining. Multilateral institutions, created largely after World War II, bear the strong mark of American participation. This is the case with the UN, United Nations, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Without the US, these entities would lose not only a major financier, but also one of their decision-making pillars. With the permanent US seat vacant, we would have a drastic change in the balance of power. as there is no automatic replacement provided for in the statutes. Powers such as India, Germany, and Japan, which have long coveted permanent member status, could compete for the vacancy, reopening the debate on profound UN reforms. The US financed a large part of UN peacekeeping operations in conflict areas. The immediate reduction in funds would put humanitarian missions at risk in countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo and Mali, resulting in a setback in the stabilization of these regions. The United States is one of the largest capital donors to the IMF and the World Bank. Without this contribution, and without the possibility of issuing dollar-backed securities, these institutions would have difficulties offering rescue packages to countries in crisis. China, through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and the new Development Bank, linked to BRICS, could try to fill the void, but the transition would not be simple. We would have a scenario of turbulent transition, in which several countries could be momentarily orphaned of external credit. With the sudden disappearance of nearly 350 million people, the world would experience one of the greatest negative population redistributions ever seen. But this also means that societies dependent on immigrants from the US could face unexpected complications. The immigrant population in the United States came from virtually all continents. Millions of people of Mexican, Filipino, Indian, Chinese, Brazilian, and many European origins were legally or not in the USA. With the country's extinction, these people would also vanish, either returning to their nations of origin or ceasing to exist in this fictional scenario. Financial remittances that once supported families in El Salvador, Haiti, or the Philippines would disappear overnight, causing social and economic crises. At the same time, if these people hypothetically returned to their native countries, we could see overloaded employment, healthcare, and education systems in those places. The USA had long been a destination for educational exchange and immigration in search of better opportunities. Without this option, students and professionals would increasingly look to Europe, Canada, Australia, and other growing countries like South Korea and Singapore. The cultural and academic movement between the USA and the rest of the world was enormous. Hundreds of international conferences, fairs, exhibitions, and sporting competitions would cease to exist in their current form, hampering the exchange of ideas and innovations. It's important to note that many multinational companies, although headquartered in the USA, have operations and offices spread throughout the world. But if the headquarters disappears, who takes control? What happens to these branches? Companies like Coca-Cola, Nike, and many others might maintain some factories and offices in other countries, but without their American headquarters, what would governance look like? Subsidiaries might try to become independent, but the financial collapse of the parent company and the lack of global leaders would shake the organization. Patent registration and copyright usually goes through American legislation when the company is based there. Without these laws and protections, products and technologies could fall under the control of other actors, generating international disputes and unauthorized copies. Berlin, London, Paris, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Singapore could host headquarters of new corporations that would emerge to fill the spaces left by American brands. This rise might favor the diversification of products and services, but could also create regional monopolies in sectors previously dominated by US giants. Without competing with American megacorporations, developing countries might see the flourishing of startups and medium-sized businesses, generating regional innovation. Still, it would take time for these companies to scale globally, as investment rounds and international mergers would be impacted by the USA's disappearance. Although religion is not itself an American product, the United States houses prominent religious and sports movements that exert worldwide influence. The megachurch model, quite popular in certain American Christian currents, has spread to other nations. The main televangelists were in the USA, with large audiences in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. With their disappearance, this segment would lose much of its media presence, possibly opening space for local voices. Thousands of missionaries, mainly Protestant, departed from the USA to spread the faith in developing countries. This network would disintegrate, affecting educational and health projects that, in many cases, were also maintained by American religious organizations. These leagues, NFL, MLB, and NBA, dominated the sports scene in U.S. territory and moved billions of dollars annually, generating contracts with broadcasters around the planet. Without them, a giant gap would appear, although the NBA, for example, has many foreign players and fans in countries like China, Spain, and Brazil. The absence of the USA might not be so drastic in soccer tournaments, but would be felt in the Olympic Games and in various disciplines where the American delegation usually shines, such as swimming and track and field. The global audience for these events would fall, or at least be redistributed, since one of the largest fan bases and advertising revenue generators would simply vanish from the map. There is no doubt that the American healthcare system, despite criticisms about costs and internal inequalities, houses centers of excellence in research, vaccine development, and combating emerging diseases. Without it, the world would become more vulnerable. The CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, has always been a bulwark in identifying and containing infectious outbreaks. With its disappearance, many countries would stop receiving alerts, technical assistance, and even mobile laboratories that were quickly sent to risk zones. A significant amount of cutting-edge clinical research takes place in American territory, funded by universities, pharmaceutical companies, and laboratories. The sudden extinction of these institutions would delay the development of medicines for rare diseases, vaccines for potential epidemics, among other important fronts. MRI machines, radiotherapy technologies, hospital ventilators, and other innovations had much of their research and continuous improvement in the USA. Without the patents and without the companies that manufacture this equipment on a large scale, global supply would decrease, leading to higher costs and less availability in poor regions. Countries with advanced medical industries, such as Germany, Switzerland, and Japan, would gain even more importance. However, the transition would be marked by temporary shortages of supplies and the need to restructure supply chains. Although the English language is not exclusive to the USA, American cultural power undoubtedly boosted the spread of the language worldwide. Without the country that, for many, represented the largest hub of English speakers on the planet, what would happen? England, Canada, and Australia. These countries would continue to exist, of course. But North American English, widely popularized by movies, series, and music, would no longer have this hegemonic presence. Educational materials around the world would have to be revised, as many are based on American cultural and orthographic references. The absence of American influence could open even more space for Mandarin, Spanish, and Hindi to grow as languages of business and culture. English, however, would still be strong, due to its adoption in many countries and international bodies, plus British prominence, but perhaps with a slower growth rate. Language schools all over the planet profited from the American dream and the possibility of studying or working in the USA. Without this possibility, many school networks and exchange agencies would lose their main product: preparation for an academic or professional future in Uncle Sam's land. Young people seeking specialization might turn to universities in the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or European countries, leading to a reorganization of the flow of global exchanges. Countries with recognized university systems, such as Germany and the Netherlands, could receive more international students, reinforcing multilingualism. Cooperation between countries occurs through economic or security blocs and alliances. Without the USA, these blocs would quickly reshape, both out of survival necessity and political opportunity. Mercosur in South America, could receive more attention from extra-regional powers, such as the European Union and China, interested in establishing free trade partnerships without strong competition from the American market. This could boost the growth of Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, but also impose new political challenges. With the expansion of Chinese power in the region, member countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations could seek greater union to avoid total dependence on Beijing. Perhaps they would seek agreements with India, Japan, and Australia, emerging as a counterweight bloc. Without direct or indirect US influence, some African countries could intensify internal cooperation and the search for joint security and development solutions. Initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area (AFCFTA) would gain even more relevance. Europe could lead a technological coalition, joining forces with Japan, South Korea, and Canada to foster research and development without depending on American big tech. This alliance would have a strong focus on data privacy standards and digital sustainability. With the United States erased, part of the world's historical memory would also be compromised. Thinking about events such as World War II, the Cold War, or even the space race without the American role is impossible. But in this hypothetical reality, museums, archives, and monuments within the vanished territory would simply cease to exist. Original documents of the American Constitution, letters from US founders, records of wars, and international treaties, all would be erased, along with buildings and digital information servers. A large hole would appear in the political and cultural chronology of the contemporary era. Important works exhibited in museums such as MoMA, the Metropolitan, and the Guggenheim in New York would also disappear. It's a blow not only to American culture but to the global artistic collection, since many of these works were created by artists of different nationalities but had American territory as their main exhibition site. Scientific and technological discoveries made in American laboratories would lose their physical records, although some are maintained in international repositories. Scientists of other nationalities who worked in the USA would also see part of their professional trajectories disappear, forcing reinterpretations of advances due to multinational teams. The popular vision of major events, such as the space race in the 1960s or the development of computer technologies in California, would become vague. The world would have to rewrite its history books, cataloging what was preserved in other countries and what, unfortunately, disappeared forever. Given so many impacts in practically all dimensions of human life, it's worth asking, are we, in fact, closer to a better world without the world's greatest power? Or would global fragility increase? Some might argue that, without American imperialism, other regions would flourish. But the absence of a strong counterweight could also lead to the unbridled expansion of regional hegemonies, resulting in conflicts. Many countries would suffer such a great initial shock, financial, technological, and military, that it would take decades to recover. Production chains only work well with stability and predictability, two things that would be lacking in this new and chaotic scenario. At the end of this reflection, perhaps the greatest truth is that, like it or not, the presence of the USA is rooted in every fiber of the world system. Removing them suddenly is not simply taking a player out of the game. It's completely changing the rules, the board, and even the objectives of the game. You, who have followed us this far, have probably already formed an opinion, or at least have many questions in your head. But we're not done yet. Let's close with a few more questions and possibilities to consolidate ideas and try to answer the big question. After all, would the world be better or worse without the United States? And, more importantly, what would we have to do to overcome the initial chaos? The first days without the USA would undoubtedly be chaotic, but as time progresses, each nation and each regional bloc would need to rebuild, making urgent decisions to reorganize the economy, diplomacy, and security. What could we envision in the medium and long term? Without the American umbrella, the European Union would need to accelerate its military and diplomatic integration, while China would increase its influence in the Pacific and possibly in emerging markets around the world. Japan, in turn, might review its defense policies to deal with new threats and security gaps. Many nations in Latin America and Africa, until then dependent on exports to the American market or immigrant remittances, would go through a period of strong adjustment but could also build new partnerships among themselves. It is possible that a more articulated global South would emerge, establishing new cooperation agreements. With American technology giants absent, the vacuum would attract regional and global players. European, Chinese, Korean, and even Indian companies could compete for market shares, creating a more fragmented but potentially more competitive digital ecosystem. The search for storage and connectivity solutions outside the USA, driven by the need for internet survival, could accelerate the adoption of technologies such as blockchain, low-orbit satellites, and neutral networks spread across various countries. Part of the great instability after the disappearance of the United States would be precisely the shock to the dollar and global credit systems. As months and years pass, we would see a global reaction to try to stabilize finances. At first, the euro would be the strongest currency to assume part of the dollar's role. The Chinese yuan, albeit with restrictions, would gain prominence in Asian markets. At the same time, we could see the yen and even the Brazilian real in Latin American trade, valued in certain regional agreements. Amid the confusion, some governments could launch digital versions of their currencies, the so-called CBDC, central bank digital currency, seeking to attract confidence from investors who fled the dollar. This would lead to an increase in the importance of blockchain platforms, but not without risks, as volatility remains a challenge. Historically, when the global financial system collapses, there are emergency meetings to create new rules. Something like a 21st century Bretton Woods conference could occur, involving remaining powers and emerging economies, defining new parameters for currency circulation and trade balance. Instead of a dominant currency, we might operate with several strong currencies and bilateral or plurilateral agreements. This would require extensive renegotiations of debts, treaties, and credit insurance, leading to a long period of adjustments until reaching some stability. Another essential point: without the American cultural matrix dictating many trends, opportunities would arise for other artistic expressions to flourish and reach audiences that previously consumed primarily Hollywood products or American showbiz. We already see worldwide interest in cultural content from South Korea, pop music and television dramas, Japan, anime and manga, and China, growing film production. Without massive competition from the United States, these countries could dominate global streaming platforms and movie theaters. The Indian film industry has a huge audience, but it's heavily concentrated in its domestic market and diaspora. Without Hollywood's magnetism, Bollywood films, full of music and dance, could capture part of that global audience seeking popular entertainment. European, Latin American, and African cities would receive more attention on cultural calendars. Without the omnipresence of American blockbusters, film festivals in places like Berlin, Cannes, Venice, Toronto, which would also be affected by proximity to the USA, but would still exist, and Rio de Janeiro could strengthen and discover new talents. The absence of large American companies and investment funds might open space for urban projects more based on regional traditions and sustainability, fostering a local identity in public spaces around the world. This exercise makes us think about how much we depend, or not, on a single power. Many people criticize the hegemonic influence of the USA, but is the scenario without this central actor more balanced and peaceful, or more unstable? It's undeniable that the USA contributed to inventions and the diffusion of democratic values in certain regions, although implementation wasn't always consistent. Many people were saved by humanitarian aid programs or by medical and technological interventions. Wars, interventions, and unilateral embargoes are also part of American history, generating resentment in many countries. In a world without the USA, nations that felt wronged may see a chance to rewrite geopolitics in their favor, which doesn't always mean more justice, but rather a rearrangement of interests. Perhaps the main lesson is the importance of a world less centered on a single country or bloc. International cooperation, guided by clear rules and equitable participation of nations with different levels of development, can avoid both single hegemony and the chaos of various poles conflicting without any regulation. Without the USA, local cultures gain new vigor. On the other hand, we would lose that global glue represented by brands, films, and icons that united people from different places around common references. In the end, imagining a world without the United States is not just a what-if game. It's a stress test that reveals how interconnected our civilization is. The dependence on the dollar, cultural influence, military power, technology, and the fact that many processes and research occur within American territory show that such a radical change would have profound and lasting repercussions. At first, we would see ruptures in all segments, from finance to communications. In a world without American power, other actors would emerge to fill gaps, shaping a multipolar and possibly more fragmented planet. The disappearance of such a relevant country would highlight the importance of collective governance and the search for solutions that are not 100% anchored in a single nation or currency. In the midst of great disasters, opportunities and renewals often arise. The absence of the USA could, paradoxically, boost scientific, cultural, and political advances in other latitudes, albeit at a very high social and economic price. There is no easy answer. It would depend on the perspective of each people, how governments would react to the sudden lack of such a powerful partner or adversary, and how societies would organize to avoid escalating conflicts. We can say at least that it would be a completely different world, challenging all our imaginations. We've reached the end of this analysis. We hope this reflection has sharpened your curiosity about global interdependence, power nuances, and the possible consequences of major geopolitical changes. If you enjoyed it, leave your comments, share what you think would happen in a world without the USA, and of course, continue following us for more content on geopolitics, history, and world curiosities. Thank you very much, and see you next time.